Welcome to the Family Pictures Podcast. I am Michael Branson Smith, and I am here with
Jim Groom.
And somehow we are shoehorning yet another teen drama or comedy from the 1980s as we continue our battle between Cameron Crowe and John Hughes, the celebrity writer, director, 80s teen comedy death match that we have started with Say Anything, continued to Hughes is Some Kind of Wonderful, and now we are back with the 1984 film The Wildlife.
And I'll tell you, Cameron's making a showing with this baby.
Yes, he is. He is putting his fists up forward. He's actually, more importantly, he's headbutting the crap out of John Hughes on this one.
Exactly. Headbutt, fist, whatever you call them. Fist bump.
And so this is my first real quick question before we even dive into this. If you were on an island and you were allowed to take only the movies of 1 year, would it be 1984?
We've talked about this on and off about 84 and it being the best year for film, at least from my perspective, given who I was. And it's a hard argument not to. Repo Man. I'm going to now include the Wildlife because I have no. I mean, we'll get to it, but this one is a classic.
Can I give you some good ones? I have a bunch.
Give me some good ones.
All right, ready?
I would miss
Repo
Alien.
Man you already mentioned, which is phenomenal.
Repo Man.
This is Spinal Tap. Streets of Fire, Walter Hill, right?
Yes.
So we got the Warriors. These are the indie ones first, like the more because I wanted to, kiss up to you, Jim. Like this is your style. Yeah. Children of the Corn, right?
One of the greats.
Yeah, it's awesome. Same thing with Firestarter. So we get two
Stephen Kings.
It's two Stephen Kings. Now we get some of the more important stuff. We got Once Upon a Time in America, Sergio Leone, and then we got all the super popular stuff: Ghostbusters, Beverly Hills Cop, 16 Candles, Karate Kid. Then we have Gremlins, Top Secret, and my most important film, Red Dawn. Wolverines, and we'll get to that. So
the other year that would be in contention is 1980.
Okay.
For one reason, The Shining.
Oh yeah. It's hard to leave that movie behind.
That would be a very hard for one because that one is really. And then I think you might also get do you get Alien or is Alien 79? It's a tight one. But anyway, 84 would absolutely be part of that conversation. Right. That Firstborn, maybe the greatest movie ever made, is 84.
Yeah, there you go. And so this film is Cameron Crowe's second script to be produced, and it's directed by Art Linson, who's really not much of a director. He's more of a producer. He did Fight Club and Heat and The Untouchables, and he must have been one of those that's like, well, maybe I can direct. I want a shot at this, and this was, I think, his second gig and an only other one. But it's the cast that really draws us in, right?
But what is Art Linson's other directorial thing? He has
it's some random film. It's before this, I think.
Yeah, but I think it's not bad. I looked it up and then forgot it. Where the Buffalo Roam with Bill Murray. Yeah, what a weird film to be his other. It's not a great film by any means, but 1980. And it's a very strange movie.
So that's for your 1980 films.
About the gonzo journalists, right? So,
okay.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Anyway, it's just a weird couple of films that he directed.
Right. But this film is much more about the cast because we've got, some of our regulars apparently on this podcast, Eric Stoltz and Randy Quaid. But it's got Christopher Penn in his second film, just coming out of having done the dancing film with Kevin Bacon. Blinking. Footloose, I think.
He was also in All the Right Moves with Tom Cruise before that.
Right.
He was in 3 or 4 films before this one.
Yeah. And so Chris Penn, this is Chris Penn's starring vehicle.
It is.
So that's right. And, we have Leah Thompson again, who was in last week's film, as well as now we have Jenny Wright, who I really hadn't thought of closely before. And, as someone who is not a horror person, generally, I think I want to watch Near Dark because it's a Catherine Bigelow
Watch
movie.
it.
No, but I could see us doing it. It's a family picture. It's a vampire family picture.
Absolutely a family picture. And Jenny Wright, no one says 80s new wave to me more than Jenny Wright. She's great.
And then, we have Rick Moranis as the lecherous boss.
Who is maybe the show stealer of this movie.
He and Hart Bachner, who comes back, the man we love to punch in the face from American, what do you call it? From
Breaking
Away. And then, he's also Hans, Bubby.
Die Hard. I had no idea.
Yeah.
I was like, where do I know this guy from? I'm like, fucking Die Hard.
And then we got Michael Bowen and Angel Salazar, both great, actors in a lot of stuff. Like Michael Bowen had been in, with the Valley Girls, which we talked about, and a bunch of other stuff. And he's gone on to, he was even in Breaking Bad more recently. So it's, and then finally, Robert Ridgely, who's the kind of dickish manager of the apartment complex that Bill moves into, and to me, he's just the Colonel from Boogie Nights, and we will continue to call him the Colonel throughout this podcast.
He
if
is
that's
amazing.
Okay.
I'll tell you though, one of the things, watching this movie again, and hindsight is always a different experience. It's like, here you're watching like 15 or 20 actors that are literally at the beginning of their career. Yeah. And it's like a whole, and many of whom go on to be very famous. And it's like the beginning of a whole new generation of actors. So as much as it's a generational film for those of us idiots who saw it in 84, it's also a generational film for like Hollywood and a lot of these talents that are coming up with it. And I dig that. This is
the, Tom Cruise generation, if you will, if you want to call it that, because he's probably the biggest standout of that crew, and Sean Penn and, obviously who's the brother of Christopher Penn. And so we should get into it. So this film was basically panned, right? Yeah. And I think in large part it was like mistakenly read as a sequel to the super successful Fast Times at Ridgemont High. It's after high school now, but, I think that was a mistake. And then it became largely forgotten because commercially it just wasn't super viable. And the music rights were prohibitively expensive. It went to VHS. It never made it to DVD. They even substituted a bunch of songs for, I think, the broadcast version like you'd find on HBO. And that was probably the most likely way you would get to watch this movie. It would be probably like was on HBO a bazillion times.
Yeah. I saw it on VHS. Definitely. That's where I saw it.
Yeah. I think that's how I saw it too. And it finally got the Blu-ray treatment in 2020. And there's a wonderful audio commentary we're going to talk about a little bit. And it has the full soundtrack restored. But, critics hated this film. And so, Jim, why are we reclaiming, see what I did there? Reclaiming the wildlife.
I love what you did. Why are we reclaiming the wildlife? Because I think it actually speaks to a lot of themes that, Cameron Crowe does well. I mean, if you take apart some of the idea that, this was just a ripoff of Fast Times at Ridgemont High. And you think like, actually, it's even a little bit more gritty and realistic than Fast Times at Ridgemont High when it comes to, and you did this beautifully, so I don't want to steal your thunder, but please. Starting from the point of work, right? Like this film in many ways is defined around not only the kids, but the jobs they do to become independent. And what those jobs look like.
Yeah. And so, I mean, they kind of pigeonholed Chris Penn, right, was replacing Sean Penn, the Spicoli of Fast Times at Ridgemont High. And Sean Penn was this kind of likable stoner doofus. Whoa. And he became the archetype. He literally created an archetype. But Chris Penn is an archetype in himself. He's the more realistic one. He's the athlete that's a drunk. Like, he's somehow capable of being a university recruited wrestler. But at the same time, and he's incredibly charming. And this is in such large part to Chris Penn's performance. He is just so affable and enjoyable.
He gets no love for this performance, and it's amazing.
It's amazing. And he's a sociopathic liar. And these are real people. It's like the modern interpretation of what Eddie Haskell probably really was. He was like an absolute charming, sociopath. And he can manipulate anybody. He can manipulate his best friend. He can manipulate his girlfriend. He can manipulate other girls. He wants to be his girlfriend. And he can get away with anything as a result. And these are real people.
I agree with that. And I think talking a little bit about Tommy Drake, one of the characteristics he has is anytime he talks to someone, they're like, "Oh, Tommy, are you Tommy Drake? That was an amazing performance you did in the regionals." And he's like, "Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it. I want to get into this, titty bar. I want to get into this." And
I want to buy some liquor.
And then the other piece that I just remembered from when I saw this as a kid is in the beginning when he's driving, and it's one of the first scenes after the scene in the high school. He goes over to his glove box, and what comes to the car, we should talk about. What comes down is kind of like an ice box, glove box that I still to this day have visions of. And I was like, what movie was that in? I remember someone did that. And then I see it. I'm like, there it is.
Yeah. He turns his glove box into a cooler for beer. Right. And he's bummed out because it's empty. And that's why he stops at the liquor store in the beginning. And I think it was like a 1968 Lincoln Continental. It's like this big, right. I mean, this is back when, I drove up. What was what car did you get to drive through high school? Did you have a car that was like something you got to drive?
No, not really in high school, but after high school, because I was 17 when I graduated high school. But when I left, I got a custom deluxe pickup truck.
Okay.
And I brought that out to California.
I had my big boat of a car, a 1971 Dodge Dart. And this was the era, like when you had your parents or whoever, my mother in this situation allows you to just, well, that's a car we can afford. It's like literally like $500, and the mechanic down the street, my mom has a great relationship with, and she'll fix it up and make sure it runs, and it's super easy to fix. And so you just have this car that's like literally, 15 years old as your first car, 16 years old. And Dodge it's hilariously awesome.
Amazing. Oh, yeah. What a great first car. And this car is interesting because it's one of those Lincolns that has the suicide doors. And it was actually similar to the car that JFK was assassinated in. And so it's one of those big Lincoln Continentals. But
it's massive.
They have cut off the roof. The roof was literally like
cut off.
Like it's not
a convertible.
A convertible. It actually removed the roof by cutting it off, and then he planted those two gigantic speakers where the back window would have been.
So this is what Tommy became. He become like he ended up becoming one of those like hot rod modifiers and started his own show 30 years later.
It's like early hot rod.
I love those reality shows. That's one of my rare reality shows that I like, is like the car modification shows. They're so fun.
Yeah, I don't know them, but I imagine I would like them if they're anything like Tommy's car.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, the thing is, part of the way I think we're going to reclaim this film is by not seeing it as like a sequel at all. It's not this. No. It's really in the vein of the people, the audio commentators. This man, Mike McPadden, and DJ Ian Christie. They're both like heavy connoisseurs of the teen movie hell genre, as they called it in their book. Well, McFadden wrote it and Christie edited it, and it's the crucible of coming-of-age comedies from Animal House to Zapped. And they accurately see it as it's more of a teen sex comedy. So, it is the male fantasy genre of guys that are just trying to get laid and party. But the funny difference is that fantasy is still baked into this film. But as we've already described, it's basically laden with the reality of they all have jobs. Yeah. And the only way they get to live this fantasy is by making money at their crappy kind of, minimum wage jobs that they probably are.
Which are all very identifiable too, whether it's a bowling alley or the donut shop or as a waitress in some greasy spoon. Like all of the jobs or the department store, like they're all very identifiable, which I like.
Yeah. So and it's literally how three of the four characters are introduced. So like Tommy's introduced with his car and trying to convince a package store clerk to give him alcohol.
One side note on that, and I'm sorry to interrupt you here, but it's interesting how it's almost to the Jeff Spicoli versus Tommy Drake, or Sean Penn versus Chris Penn. Spicoli's final scene is in a liquor store, right?
It's a convenience. It's a convenience store. It's more of a Circle K.
Yeah. Similar, right? It's almost as if Spicoli walked in and now Chris Penn, just to match him, is walking into this one. It seemed very similar, but anyway.
Yeah, except for you didn't get to have Judge Reinhold as the clerk. Oh my gosh, this is through the audio comment. The clerk is I'm blanking. He's like this incredible writer.
Yeah, he's a writer who wrote like Independence Day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Roland Emmerich. He worked a lot with Roland Emmerich, and he had incredible success.
He just looks like a kid, whatever. And they're like, that's the guy who wrote Independence Day and this and the other thing. I was like, what?
Yeah, it's crazy. And so, I like just to give a quick rundown of these characters and how they're introduced. So Bill, who's the Eric Stoltz character. He's introduced through his job at the bowling alley, and he's working the table, and he's getting crap from his boss for not serving the bullying league players. And they're like, there are regulars. And we later, we learn that Tommy also works with him, and he's got the gross, disgusting job of literally like fumigating the worn shoes that everybody rents when they go to the bowling alley. And they all briefly imagine themselves, I want to keep these shoes,
Exactly. These are kind of cool.
Gross. These are kind of cool. Were you a bowling alley kid in high school?
Yeah, I went to the bowling regularly, but I didn't bowl as much as I played the video games in the bowling alley.
Yeah.
Star Castle.
And that's so the bowling alley it was also a big part of my identity as in high school too, and in the roller skating rink too. That's where I played video games.
For me,
yeah, the roller skating rink. I don't think there's a film out there that does the 80s roller skating rink well. No. I wish there was.
No justice. Not to that one. There's the 70s one, the disco roller rink and all that. Like they do that well. But or Xanadu kind of does the weird one well. But nothing that does that like arcade / going out for a date and fights and everything else at those roller rinks.
And birthday parties and pizza and and renting skates and imagine couple skates in the penalty box and stuff like that.
The slow skate and will she skate with you? We should make that movie.
No shit. Maybe this leads to us writing scripts someday. Who knows?
Who knows?
And then also Anita, who's like played by Leah Thompson. Anita is Bill's ex-girlfriend because he's a grown man. He can't be seen going out with a girl in high school anymore.
I love that. I can't see picking her up. How embarrassing.
I know. He can't be seen picking her up at high school. And she has a job at the classic donut shop. Yeah. And it's really gross because she's literally like with her fingers like dipping the donuts in the the frosting and then dipping the frosted donut in the sprinkles and then putting them on the tray. And behind her are literally like glazed donuts dripping sugar into an open wash bin. You're like, oh my God. You're
right about the details though of this.
Yeah. And that's something, and this is something that I think is so true about, I miss about films in general is like, so the production notes, they talked about how both Anita's job, the donut shop, was a real donut shop. Bill's, was the real bowling alley, and also the department store. And so what's interesting, so we'll talk about Eileen. Eileen, who's played by Jenny Wright. She works in not like a high-end fashion store. She works in the couture section of a department store. And that's why I was always like, why is the name of the store on their tags different from the name of Fashion Dynasty? It's because it's not even a real store. It's just a section of a larger department store. And she has to deal with like her boss, played by Rick Moranis, who's like probably for the 20th time trying to teach her how to upsell, like belts. It's like, they got it. Oh, that was so great. You sold some slacks or a shirt. Did you sell any slacks? Maybe next time, make sure you get that memo about your TPS reports. Can you do that for me?
Rick Moranis is amazing in this role. This is only his third film. He did Strange Brew, and that's Canadian, I believe. But then he came over and he did Ghostbusters and follows that up with this. I love Rick Moranis. This is an amazing, almost film stealing part, even though it's a small part.
It's a very small part. And he also does Ghostbusters this same year. So it's the year of Rick Moranis. It's probably his peak. And so they in the production notes, they talked about how literally the bowling alley and the department store shoots were during work hours. So they're shooting while the businesses are still actually operating, And it's this is very Cameron Crowe, and it's kind of old Hollywood too. It's these really lived in real spaces. I think that's what you like about the film with the perfect 80s house. It's like a real house. It's not this staged area that they like to try to make it lived in and real. And so this is how we get to know these characters, and that's what ultimately I think sets it aside from the true like teen fantasy sex comedy. It's kind of depressing, right? Their lives are they're not going to college. You can see them in 20 years that this is what they might be doing. One of my favorite early quotes is from, and we haven't even gotten to Jim yet, is Bill's brother, who's the crazy Vietnam obsessed kid. And he's like, he has this quote, he's hanging out in the bowling alley and he's like, fucking muscleheads, they all turn out to be cops. They all grow up to be cops,
And he's a memorable character because and if you did that, what he did to those muscleheads where I would grow up, he would get his ass kicked. So I was like, what is he like? Is he Bruce Lee or something? Like, is he going to pull something out? But he counts on them not beating his ass. And that was interesting. But he's also the one who says to his brother, Bill, he says, oh, big deal, you're moving 14 blocks away. As if even the fact that even though Eric Stoltz's character, Bill, is dying to leave the house, they're not going that far from their reality.
No, they're not.
They're stuck
and
in
that's
that
part.
reality.
And in the end of the film, we find out he knows it was likely going to fail. And so that's his brother. So we have Eric Stoltz plays Bill Conrad, the brother of Jim Conrad, and we're going to get into this weird aside of this film of this Vietnam obsessed kid played by Elan Mitchell Smith, who's probably more famous for his role in Weird Science with Anthony Michael Hall. Yeah. And a John Hughes script, not directed, but the connections between these two writer directors are endless. And so what was interesting, it was through the audio commentary, and also one of the things I also discovered when with Cameron Crowe, he still has a website called uncool.com, which is hilarious because it's not modern web standards at all. And so, you have to open a page and the text is like rent. It's super wide and you're trying to read stuff. But he puts production notes from all his films up there, and they just stay up there. It's like they're the notes that were released as part of I would imagine the promotional package of the film when it was going out. So there's a lot of contextualized quotes from the writers and directors and actors and where they were in their careers at that time to try to pitch the reviewers and writers out there of where this film has landed. And part of that, between he and his notes and the commentary, they talked about this film was originally supposed to be this Jim Morrison biographic interpretation set in the 80s with a misanthropic, like Vietnam obsessed kid. And it was very Cameron Crowe, similar to being inspired by the way he was in Say Anything, by meeting a kickboxer in real life. And it was actually Chris Penn, who was like 15 or 16 when he met him on the set of Fast Times. And Chris Penn was literally going through this phase where he was walking around with his boombox, listening to Jimi Hendrix and wearing camouflage. And, you know, Crowe was really interested, just like he was the kickboxer. It's like, what makes this guy tick? And, you know, why is he obsessed with, you know, this era of film? But first I want to ask you, like, did you know any kids like this in your days as like junior high school?
Absolutely. Yeah, the whole idea of the boombox and the camos, and just kind of like a derelict, but a different kind of derelict. Absolutely. Yeah. Even the point to the poster that's in Jim's room that has a picture of Jim Morrison up kind of, you know, in his almost like Jesus Christ-like stance, and it says Jim Morrison, an American poet. We used to, as high school kids, used to make fun of this whole idea of Jim Morrison as a poet. Me and one of my friends were always like, Jim Morrison, he's a poet, you know, like, man, like of that way, because there were those people who loved the Doors, and particularly Jim Morrison, and be like, he's a fucking poet, man. Don't talk shit about him. And we're like, what the fuck, Jim Morrison, right? Like, enough. Like, it's 1984. Grow up. Jim Morrison's dead.
So this is part of, I had a person. So there's this other character, Tony, so Jim is obsessed with Vietnam, and we can talk about, like, you've already described, like, his room. This is one of the important settings of this is the family picture side of this actual podcast.
There's a lot of family picture I think we can find here. But
yeah.
Anyway.
We're going to get there. And his room is important. And he's got like this huge poster of Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, and he's got pins on it, like he's like tracked where certain battles have happened, and he's got his like booby trap, you know, handbook, and he's got a cockatoo which he dances with. But the crazy thing is he's like doing nunchucks, and he's like super good with the nunchucks, and so he's like kind of a badass kind of 15-year-old. And he has an acolyte, and Tony, his friend. When we first meet Tony, Tony's got a flak jacket on. He's like, cool flak jacket, dude. That's like vintage, right? You know, it's like awesome. And the funny thing is, I was a Tony. All right. In my gym was my best friend. One of my best friends growing up was Chris Hall. And we, unsurprisingly, as two kids that were interested in war in the 80s, and Cameron Crowe talks about it being Apocalypse Now that got that, like, he's obsessed with and romanticizing. But it's this generation. It's like Cameron Crowe. He's kind of betwixt, you know, boomers and Gen X, but he trends more towards boomer ultimately, I think, in his thinking. And they produced like a dozen or so Vietnam movies. You know, Platoon and Hamburger Hill and Full Metal Jacket and Casualties of War and First Blood and Rambo 2 and Born on the 4th of July and The Deal Hunter and Uncommon Valor and Missing in Action, and all these films that we consume. My friend Chris Hall and I, we were like inhaled these things. And it was our just way of, you know, rectifying what these adults were trying to tell us was this thing is really important. We have to consume this. And this is also in the context of the Reagan's 80s of, you know, mediated fear of nuclear war.
But the reading of that, and I really love this, but the whole idea is like, as a kid growing up in the 80s, and particularly in the Reagan 80s, as he starts to get his momentum, is how could America have lost the war to Vietnam? Like that's the whole idea. It's like, we lost to Vietnam of all things, this little country out in Asia, and what happened? And then there's that whole idea of the vet, which is beautifully played by Randy Quaid in this. And we can get to that. But like, I really think, and I, like you, consumed Uncommon Valor, all those films. Uncommon Valor was a particular favorite. But like, this whole idea of reliving Vietnam through the media, through our parents and our kind of another generation's trying to come to terms with it. and it was all imposed on us. And we were like, what do we make sense of this? But then Rambo comes along, and Rambo's like, actually, we won the war, and we can still win the war.
And we can reclaim it. Same with Missing in Action with Chuck Norris, right? It's like, we'll just, and it was this way of, I mean, First Blood wasn't that. Like First Blood was the, the disaffected, vet. And
I didn't draw First Blood. I didn't draw First Blood.
And so it was just, I mean, and it's something that like the Tony character, I don't know what happens to Jim because he's more of the miscreant and you don't know what he's going to be. But Tony, you probably was, I related more to him because he was like more of the probably nerdy kid who's like latching on to Jim and just being interested in this world. And it was a pretty intoxicating world because like my friend Chris Hall, like we just spent time in the woods and his dad would take us to turkey shoots and they'd shoot at targets with guns and, and go carp fishing with a bow and arrow. And we would just go out in his canoe and catch turtles. And it was this kind of amazing world. And we were just also obsessed. And Red Dawn was like the pinnacle of like, this is how we prepare as teenagers. This is how we'll be ready when we're invaded. And we played war constantly, well beyond the ages you would think you were supposed to.
I already told my story, but Teenage Preppers that's another script we should write, market. But I already told my story, like our Vietnam story, where my brother would treat me and my friends. My brother and his friend would treat me and my friends as prisoners of war and put us in a dog kennel and then whip us with sticker bushes. So that was my exposure. Like that's how Vietnam had sunk into my family existence, is abuse, torture, like Deer Hunter like torture.
Well, we were we were training to be basically Green Berets and SEALs, and we'd put on our camouflage and our face paint, and we were allowed to go out at night, in the middle of the summer, so it must have been really late, and we would go to this golf club and we would go and sneak from behind into the driving range and we would salvage all the golf balls that the auto carrier couldn't pick up, and there would be people up top at a higher above in the parking lot with their cars, and their lights would swing by, and those were like the searchlights that we would hide from, and we were just maniacs back then. And so I completely identify with this kid obsessed who's I think Cameron Crowe sees him as like an outlier, but it was definitely very real, and people lived it in very different ways, the Tony versus the Jim. And I think it was this sense of the 80s that was so big and well described in this format. And one thing, just to comment, I know you didn't have an opportunity to list the entire audio commentary from McFadden and Christie, and they ground one of the things they do is they love to ground this film so firmly in 1984. Because it was such a big year of American culture. We had the Olympics with the boycott, right? And we won like everything, things that we had never won ever before. And McDonald's lost $1 billion because they were giving away free Big Macs.
You told that story on this podcast, which is a great one.
And then, Reagan's ascendant with his reelection, and literally, which is connected directly to this film, Van Halen's 1984 is released, and MTV's taken over the music industry, and hair metal is rising, Ghostbusters, Footloose. It's just, they just love how this film sits perfectly in that space, but rejects like kind of some of the perfections that were trying to be presented to us, at that time.
Well, I really like too, just the way in which you said this is filmed in real space. And I think a lot of these films, that's one of the things I appreciate about them, is the spaces, is the way in which they exist. And they're spaces I remember, and they bring back all sorts of memories because they're so identifiable. Like outside behind the donut shop, there's a sign you can know. And they were like, oh, I thought this was filmed outside of LA, but I knew it wasn't because the sign says Sepulveda. And Sepulveda Boulevard is actually the place I lived in Los Angeles when I moved out there in the 90s. And so many of these places are tangible and places I would have seen when I was out there. And so I really appreciate this about these films. I love the idea of space in these films that kind of trigger memories. And this film is great for that.
Yeah. And so to get into deeper, finally, some of these family spaces, we were introduced to Jim in his room doing nunchucks, but Bill comes home and because his mom is yelling at him. His mom is great. She's presented. It's like she's in bed and she's got a cold mask on and she's trying to do her toenails. And Jim's got like his heavy metal music playing and she just wants some peace and quiet because she's probably had a huge day of work. Because we learn later she's a single mom holding down the fort for these two boys. And she's not successful. And so Bill walks into the bedroom and it's like, Mom said you smelled like beer. And, and this is where their interaction as brothers really starts to begin. And we've seen them interact a little bit, at the bowling alley, but Jim and Bill, you get a sense that Bill is trying ever so earnestly, but lightly at the same time, trying to play the role of father figure. Right.
Yeah.
And we learn that Dad's not around.
No,
right?
He's gone. He left at 40. Yet, Bill is still trying to be like his dad. Because like him, his dad left the house early when he was 17 or 18 to go out. And so there's that sense of the dad's legacy being there, but the dad gone. And so the whole broken family idea, the latchkey kids and that's a big idea in the 80s too. It's what a lot of these films start to deal with. We talked about Stepfather already, but like there are some key moments where you start to see the non-traditional ideal family, but yet they're not abnormal, right? These are kids who are going about their life and doing their thing, and they have the same problems as those kids who have parents. And there's a kind of normalization of this new normal, if you will. I said normal a lot. But like that sense that there's a kind of, it's not these outcasts and now they're like, these lost kids. In fact, it's part of the 80s landscape.
Yeah. And Jim is, he's left to wander around at night. And it's so awesome. We haven't even mentioned like they're constantly smoking cigarettes. And, Jim's literally, this is back when you could still buy cigarettes from machines in the bowling alley. And
they're constantly eating cigarettes too.
Totally.
That's the weird thing in this movie.
We're going to get to the Dick Rude character at some point. I love him. And so, Jim's really flippant, and it's like you care about Mom. That's a laugh. And the next morning, Mom is hefting this giant. Oh gosh, 1 second. We got to pause. My mom's here. 1 second. My mom's busy.
Absolutely.
Hi, Mom. My mom's listening too.
Listen. Mom.
Mom.
This is a Family Pictures podcast.
This is the Family Pictures podcast. This is the greatest
part of it you could ever have. I know. We got to keep it.
We'll see how much of this we'll keep, right?
Mom. You're very nice to your mom, Michael. She would be proud, and so should you be. I'd be like, Ma! Shut the fuck up, Ma! I'm on a fucking podcast, Ma!
I'm doing what's a podcast?
Exactly. Get over here. I'm done with the cigarette. You got to go out and get me Marlboro 100s.
So speaking of mom, I love how my mom enters as we're about to talk about the mom.
Talking about the mom.
So we're talking about Jim and Bill's mom, and she enters, Bill's room as he's packing up to leave. And she's got this massive, shoulder mounted VHS camcorder that she's like borrowed from a friend. And the film does this, the viewfinder point of view. So it's like this inset black and white frame. And, she's talking about how their dad lived. That's how we learn. And she's holding down the fort. And, Bill, this is Bill's big moment. Right. He's graduated high school. He's going to be, as you described, a man of his own. And this is where you're right. And he's packed his Toyota truck with his pachinko machine. And at the same time, Jim is giving him such shit for saying like, oh, big man moving 14 blocks away.
Yeah, totally. I love that relationship because it's really like, I wouldn't be like, oh, I'm going to miss you, Kevin or Billy who left. I'd be like, you're a fucking loser. You're loser. You're moving up north. I mean, good for you. Like, I would be like Jim. So I really identified with this where they're giving each other shit. And, there's a lot of love there, but they're also different and they love to kind of, being their own and having to deal with their parents. They're freaking teenagers.
Yeah, he's 100% a teenager. However much he thinks he's a young adult, and it comes out. It's like, this is what we agree upon, Mom, and she's like, I don't see why you have to do this, and it's so wonderful.
It's great. It's a really good scene. I agree with that, and like it's almost touching because for a moment they're together, but then Jim is like uncomfortable and leaves, and then she turns around, he's giving the finger, and she's like, Jim, don't do that. What are you doing? This is a permanent record, and then like there's that whole thing. It's a great scene, actually. It's one of my favorites from the movie.
Yeah. And so the other kind of situations we learn about, Eileen's kind of familial situation through some Pee-Pee Tom action by Tommy, because again, he's a complete miscreant.
Which goes to the teen sex movie a bit, right?
Yeah,
like you always have to have a pair of tits in a movie like this, right?
Yep. But Eileen seems to have more of the traditional suburban contained household. It's not like a John Hughes super upper middle class massive house, north of Chicago household. But it's a simple ranch house with the basketball hoop above the garage, and her bedroom is like the classic teen, 80s hip new wave woman girl's room, right? She's got like, what were some of the cool things? She's got a pink flamingo lamp, she's got the upward sconce. Remember, like that was like such a big deal, lamps that would just point straight up and they would light upward, and that was it. And it was like this super modern, like
it's like a Newport, like everything in the 80s was some sort of Newport, and those were the colors of the 80s. And like,
it was very pink.
I was just waiting for
pastel.
a Spuds MacKenzie thing or whatever. I mean, like it was definitely like a time capsule.
Right. And she has these artifacts that are cool from the past. There's James Dean, and there's some Beatles records at the same time. And as many times, Tommy just completely invades this space, and he does his like puppy dog eyes things, which like Chris Penn just does so well. And it's like, I'll scream, I'll get my mom and dad in here. And sure enough, he like, he convinces her for a minute, and then she regrets it immediately and screams, and he's like tumbling out of the window because he's climbed basically up the porch above her bedroom, and he falls right out onto the ground. And it wouldn't surprise me if Chris Penn was literally like taking a dive from the top of a roof.
And I wonder, like, I always think about this in films. Like, there's that scene where he jumps out the window and then rolls down the roof and then falls into the bushes and then jumps into the car. And it's like, that's got to be a stunt man, right? Like, Chris Penn didn't do that. And it's pretty cool stunt. Like, I just, these are throwaway scenes, but I'm like, what a cool stunt. Like, what a crazy job stuntmen had.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, he's no Tom Cruise for stunts, but, still.
Exactly. There you go.
And, so there's really, really very, at the end of the film, we have this brief, cameo of Tommy's real dad, Leo Penn, Sean Penn and Chris Penn's actual dad pops in for a hot minute. And it's funny because throughout the entire film, Tommy has been a complete, moron in every way he possibly can, but being super charming at the same time. And it ends with this epic 80s party, of course. And there's absolute aftermath. There's absolute destruction, and the aftermath is really a lot of fun. And awesome. But at the same time, like, he gets busted. We finally like realize he's not this guy who gets to cruise around in his car all night and go to strip clubs and show up whenever he feels like at the bowling alley. His dad shows up in the middle of the massive party and literally grabs him by the ear and says, like, "You're worrying your mom's sick." And he's like, "Sorry, Dad."
It's also interesting because you got Chris Penn being taken out by his real dad, and in At Close Range, which is 1986, and it's a film we already talked about, you have Chris Penn interacting with his real mom. And so, like, I think Ellen Ryan is her name. And so, like, and there's, like, the whole thing, like, the Penn family. But it brings
the Hollywood families.
Yeah, it's interesting. But it brings me to one of the big points for me about this film as on a personal level is, so, I had seen, as everyone had, Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Blew my mind. Jeff Spicoli, Sean Penn, amazing. You didn't really know he was Sean Penn. You just knew there was a Jeff Spicoli. right?
Uh-huh.
But then I start to realize in '84, like Sean Penn became a big deal by then, and Chris Penn was his younger brother, and I'd seen him in Footloose and All the Right Moves, and so then I had an older brother who I idolized, even though he whipped me like a POW, and I would do everything he did. He was a surfer, and he was probably a stoner, and like so he did all these things, and I idolized him, and so like for me, for Chris Penn to be picking up and walking in the boots of his brother and doing this role, I couldn't help but identify with Chris Penn on a deep level as a 13 or 14-year-old watching this film and seeing him and saying, like, this is Chris Penn's moment, right? Like, he's coming out and he's doing his own. And to your point, he nails this role, but he gets no love like his brother did for Spicoli. And, they kind of say, look, there was no change in the character. He was always who he was. And it was like, that's the whole point. It's like Dazed and Confused, right? Those characters don't change. They're always the same. And that was what was great about them. And I think...
And it's what's great about the film in general, too.
Yeah, totally. So
it's much more of a Linkletter film. Sorry, you go ahead, finish.
No, I was going to say exactly what you said. Like, I think this movie was misread and misinterpreted and held up to what Amy Heckerling did with Fast Times at Ridgemont High is amazing. But this is not that, right? This is its own thing. And I think it's an important point you make early on to distinguish the two and let it breathe on its own.
Yeah, I think that's what I ultimately, when I started just reading all the work moments and even, so there's this moment there's two more interesting spaces to talk about, like, so quote unquote homes. And one is Charlie. So Tony and Jim, our Vietnam obsessed brother, apparently has a vet that's a friend, and Tony really wants to meet him. And Charlie's played by Randy Quaid, and he's basically a heroin addict living in a shack. And, they think it's so cool. And he just reads in the riot act about, like, you don't want to really be there. Like, and it's this conversation about, because they're hanging out for a hot minute with Charlie, and Charlie's just completely fucked up, and he has to go to the bathroom because he needs a plug to just like get through the moment. And so, but what ultimately in rewatching this, because I remember this character and I remember how sad that is. Like, it's this moment where, Jim's like idol is kind of revealed to be nothing but more than a junkie trying to get by post, with probably tons of post-traumatic stress disorder and all that went on. And all that he witnessed in the chaos of, there's a moment it's described, he endured like 26-hour firefight, and survived. Yeah, like that's exactly. Like, I can't even, it's unimaginable. But one of the things that I remember watching it again is the space that he lived in. He lives in like this firewood lumber yard. And it's this shack that's literally surrounded by mountains and mountains of firewood. Yeah. And this is that thing. It's like, it is this really gross lived in world. Like, Cameron Crowe didn't truck in this firewood for anything. They're like, look at this fucking shack that we found in this, like, space in the area. And it's like, yeah, this is where a vet would be trying to survive.
Yeah. And I remember that scene clearly. And it was interesting to go back to it, after so many years. I was struck by the fact that this is kind of one of the first times I understood, like, oh, wait, shooting up something? It's heroin? Like, that whole idea was a kind of new concept to me. And this film, like, this is a moment where what is kind of a comedy goes dark for a second, right? It's like, oh, wait, and Randy Quaid plays it really well. And the actor who plays Jim says that when he was dealing with Randy Quaid, he was like, Randy Quaid was a super weird dude who like gave him like the creeps. And like he said like one or two things to him. It's not like he was a mean guy, but he was really like insane. And it really made me like Randy Quaid. But this is an interesting role. And Randy Quaid is on screen for like 15, 20 seconds. but it's one of
Oh,
the
yeah,
another
barely on.
great memorable character from this movie. Right, I really like it, and it's a really, it goes dark quick, and then they get out of there, and then it's also that guy Jim has to make sense of what he just saw and deal with the kid Tony to keep things normal. Like, yeah, you know,
Right.
la 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 la, but like there's a point where Vietnam becomes real, right, and the post
just for a
facto
moment.
of Vietnam, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I remember just not even understanding it at that time. Like, I didn't know what heroin was at that age. And I was like, what's going on in there? And I mean, it's not like I ever really figured it. I just knew something bad was happening.
Exactly.
Like, they give
Something bad,
you know,
right? Yeah, totally.
and so you didn't know, because we were young in that age. We were basically, you know, the equivalent of Jim's age. He was only 14. Yeah. And there's a great little interview and extras what I gave to his interview. He's, you know, the actor Elan Mitchell Smith was he was briefly an actor, and he talked a lot in his interview about how it just wasn't his thing. You know, he saw these people around him that were much more into it and much more obsessed, and he felt like, I'm not that.
Not
and
a
he
method
becomes
actor like Eric Stoltz.
No, nor Randy Quaid probably. Or Randy Quaid's just fucking weird. I mean, God,
betcha,
he's weird now. If you read his Wikipedia, like, he's a nutbag now.
Awesome.
Anyway, and so you know, he also you know, he just moved on, and that's some of these characters. That's what happens with these actors too at this era. Like, he becomes a medieval studies professor. You know,
At Long Beach, at Cal State Long Beach, which is crazy.
yeah.
And it's he's interesting. I mean, that, and his interview was interesting because he was also like, you know, I wasn't a very good actor. I just got lucky.
No.
But I really liked him in The Chocolate War, which is one of his
Yeah.
last big films, and that's a great 80s movie too. And I really liked him in that. But I mean, it was interesting. He was kind of an interesting dude because he was like, yeah, you know, I did it. I'm not doing it anymore. People still want to talk to me about it. That's fine, but that's not who I am anymore, which is kind of a cool way to approach it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not unlike Mary Stuart Masterson as well. You know,
Yeah, exactly.
Even though I think she had a lot more success as an actor. But anyway, I think the last space as a family space I think is interesting to talk about is because we've barely touched on Hart Bachner, the mustachioed cop who's been pursuing Anita and effectively learned that she's been lying. So Anita, you know, one of there's a number of scenes with Anita played by Leah Thompson working the donut shop, and there's this cop that's waiting for her, and you know, and he's putting on this act. It's like, can I check your back security? It's okay. I'm a cop. And it's basically his squeeze on the side. And he convinces Anita, it's like, no, I like you. I want to be with you. And so Anita, just being 17, is like, okay. And at a certain point, there's this wonderful scene with her and Eileen hanging out in Eileen's house. And that's one of the things that also, it's like the absence of Anita's home life too, I noticed for the first time. Anita, and I love stuff like that because it makes me think of, you know, some kind of wonderful, maybe it's like that Leah Thompson character that doesn't want people going to her house so much.
Totally. Yeah.
You know, it's like, maybe it's not a great situation. And that's one of those things about the 80s too, is like, if you remember, there were families that you would choose, you wanted to hang out with because their parents were more chill usually. Right.
Totally.
You know, and
there were other plans you wouldn't go to.
No, because you were going to get yelled at, or you were going to witness your best friend getting yelled at, and you know, you didn't want to be party to that, and that's a big part of this. And I feel like I was imagining that's Anita and how and why she's always at Eileen's. So she's getting ready to go out, and Eileen's house is a safe house, and that's always like one of those spaces where like kids are, you know, come on, there's food, whatever you want, and so easily I kind of read that. But there's this moment where they're on the bed. And they're talking about, you know, Dave the cop. And so they make this decision to go to his house so they can look for him and see if his roommate Rick's there.
Yeah.
And Anita goes to the door and knocks on it. And sure enough, his wife answers with their son, Rick.
Exactly. That's pretty low.
And, and so this is the invasion of family. It's like, it's not her fault. And the miscreant, cheating, philandering husband who's got a wife and a child. Oh, and she's pregnant as well. They do the effort to have, and it's actually Nancy Wilson of the band Heart.
I didn't know that was a good pickup. Good.
Yeah. And she's also the one who played the hot girl next to Judge Reinhold in Fast Times at Ridgeside High when he's, thinking he's super cool, but he's wearing his stupid pirate outfit
or his uniform it out for work. The window after that.
Yeah. Anyway, so, they have her wearing a Baby on Board styled t-shirt or something. So just to gut punch the audience a little bit more. And so, this is the moment, and this is like one of my favorite moments. There's there's the party and the aftermath. But I think my favorite is ultimately the donut shop showdown where, Anita, throughout the film, like Jim and Tony basically drift between two spaces. They drift between the bowling alley and the donut shop. And, Jim knows Anita because his older brother dated her. And so he's friendly with her and so it's super cool. It's like, but he sees, Dave the cop, like basically, pulling Anita into the back gross room where all the dripping donuts are and sugar on, just so, they can hook up. And so now that Anita's found out and Super Cop Dave is hanging out thinking he's going to get some, and Anita confronts him. And in the meantime, what's Jim doing?
Jim is actually like sabotaging his car, right?
Yeah,
I don't know exactly what he did to sabotage it. Do you?
Well, he's got a booby traps manual in his bedroom, so he clearly knows what to do.
The anarchist cookbook. He figured out something.
Well, he also went to
which is a great scene.
The surplus store, the Army surplus store, which is something I literally did back in Connecticut.
We had one in our room. Oh, you said you had one in Connecticut. We had one in our town. They were very popular.
Yeah, they were. It was cool. Like I found this article about them too, which was really funny because they were like this. They were a real thing that was. Well, we have all the war's over, men. We have all this army supplies, and they would sell them to these stores for resale to the public. Yeah. And that's how they existed. Now, what do? They said, war's over, men. Or maybe it's like, well, we have too much surplus. Let's give them to the cops so all the cops can look like freaking, people in fatigues. And it went wrong.
And it also created a whole style. And like we see with Jim, a style that was very prevalent in the 80s. Camos, those flak jackets or what have you.
But they were actually
bomber jackets.
Vintage stuff that was worn by actual vets and stuff like that.
Yeah, I love that scene with Ben Stein and it's a memorable one. So many scenes when I watched it again, I was like, oh my God, this scene. Yeah. Oh my God, that scene. But with Ben Stein trying to sell him a Vietnam, jacket, and he's like, this is new. There was no 44th Regiment or whatever it was. It was just like, that's a really cool, memorable scene. And there's many of them, but that's another thing. Like this film speaks to you just in terms of like the army supply store, the bowling alley, right? The donut store, the department store. These are all spaces we're familiar with. We may not work in them all, but we circulate around them. Just like Fast Times at Ridgemont High did beautifully with the mall, right? Like this idea of this is a very identifiable series of spaces that as a kid, and they think they said it in the commentary, can put you in, anywhere America and have you kind of have these kind of visions. This just happened to be in California because that's where they filmed it. But there's that real sense in this movie that I really like. But also we didn't tell, one of my favorite scenes is the scene when they go to the nudie bar. And this is the whole sex comedy thing, but you have them doing their wrestling, headbutting and everything. But you have these three young guys, kind of young, probably attractive, all of that, versus these three old guys next to them. And there's this tension building beautifully between them as Chris Penn is awesome. He's like, he's like going like, and he's playing with it. He's like, keep your pecker in your pants. And Chris Penn just kind of knocks the guy and laughs, thinking like they're all buddies and having a good time. And these guys are getting angrier and angrier. And then it kind of explodes in this big brawl, right? And it's just, I think that's a very fun scene. I mean, obviously, you know, depending on your mileage and given it's a sex comedy from the 80s, it may not work out as well in other contexts, but it's certainly one of those, and them trying to get in, and the bouncer with his hand as big as their face. It's just,
that was the guy who was the predator.
Oh, get out of here.
This is why you got to watch the audio commentary, because McPadden and Christie, I think it was Christie who points out, it's like what they point out about that scene, which I think is so great, is they're like, there's the juxtaposition of these older dudes and the younger dudes, and they're mirror images. Like, this is what Tommy and his wrestling bros are going to be in 20 years. Like, wake up, kids, this is what you're going to become. But they don't know that, you know. But that's what I thought, that relationship was really great. And they point out like the bouncer is the guy who played Predator, and you know, so it's a really fun hang with those two doing the audio commentary, and so but back to the donuts of Jim blows up the cop car, which is this is back to these fantasy things like the nudie bar, the blowing up the man, you know. I mean, Jim at the beginning of the film blows up his high school statue, you know, that's out like a Trojan or something, whatever he is.
And I think he puts a pipe bomb in it, right?
Yeah, he does. He's got booby trap expertise, you know, the Anarchist Cookbook. And, and then there's the big mega party at the end too, which is all part of this fantasy, and it's super gross at the same time. But what's so fun is like, so, you know, they kind of end up both with their girls. Like, even, you know, Tommy kind of gets Eileen back, but it's not going to last. And maybe Anita and Bill stay together, but it doesn't really matter. What matters, and this is my other favorite thing, they talk about, it bookends with school again. So the film started with, we didn't even talk about it, Jim breaks into high school.
Yeah.
And he's like listening to Born to Be Wild, and he starts singing it while he's drinking a beer and smoking a cigarette next to the principal's office. And a security guard shows up and he goes, "Hey, what do you do here?" And so he's doing this like really anarchistic thing. And then as soon as the security guard comes up, he's like super polite. He's like, "Yes, sir. No, sir." And that's like that classic contrast to these kids who think they're so badass, but when confronted with a scary adult, they're just like, "I'm sorry."
Exactly.
And the film bookends with the first day of high school because, Jim's going, he's still, we don't know what year he is, but he's probably like a sophomore. And you also have, Eileen's got to go to school, and I would assume
Tommy.
Also Anita, and Tommy has to go to school. Yeah, because it's only Bill who's done with high school.
Yeah, only Bill.
And the great thing is the two Christie and McPadden were talking about how much they fucking hated the first day of school, and they talk about so much how brutal it is. You know, everybody in their new fucking outfits trying to like show off and talk about their summer, and in all this false effort of performing in the first day. And meanwhile, it's like they hated it. They must have hated high school so much because it's like absolute hell. And and so you know how the security guard like locks the door, and it's like, and they're getting locked in for yet another year.
I think the final, like for me, the lesson of this film is what Tommy says to Bill. So basically he says, "Look, you know what? Like, we may have gotten kicked out. It didn't last as long as you hoped. But you threw the party that in 10 years, everybody will still talk about." And frankly, I feel that about some of the parties I went to in high school. And there are friends of mine who feel that way. And when we get together, we talk about them. And there's this sense of like, maybe the moments are these small like moments where you just say, "What the fuck?" and you throw a big party and you have a blast and maybe you ruin someone's apartment or not. But like,
or you get grounded for like 10 years
exactly.
or whatever.
But he's back the next morning helping him clean up. And I don't know. I mean, obviously that's probably not
Lawsuit.
a philosophy or a life's, a worldview. But it's in line with the small sense of this film of like the daily life and the quotidian. It's like, you know what? Throwing a great party, Bill, is something to be proud of. And you've accomplished something, and you'll be known as the one who threw the best party that all of these people have ever been to. And I think, like, frankly, like, I'm kind of on board with that philosophy or with that idea. Like, I'm like, yeah, good for you, Bill.
I mean, there is the recklessness of being a teenager too. There's these things because our frontal lobes aren't fully developed, and we do really stupid things. And it's good that you do stupid things because this is how you learn. I mean, hopefully you don't get physically damaged yourself. Because you look like back and you kind of
now. What are you, a teen psychologist?
No, well, I mean, come on. There are things
These kids just fucking created a party and it was fun.
Oh, no, this is not. Well, they also blew through a wall and destroyed an apartment. And I mean, there's a million other things.
Happened to those two, I'm sure. They have
those two would have gone to.
Those two would have earmuffs.
Absolutely go. Oh my God, yeah, they were like Rick Moranis' character from Ghostbusters, basically. It's so funny.
Totally, actually, that's right. They were.
Yeah, I think that the amount of time those two would have ended up in jail for multiple things, I mean, Jim for blowing up a cop car, starting a fight in a strip club, or destroying an apartment in an apartment complex and filling the pool with pizza and gross, like there's got to be vomit and all sorts of.
Can I ask you, do you know people you grew up with who did stuff like this?
I mean, the level of craziness is not quite there. There were stupid things, right? I mean, and there were definitely parties, and we definitely all had them, even hosted them, right? And whose house didn't have the parent there? That was the classic one.
I would say that I grew up in a town where the things that happen there far exceed anything that happened in this movie.
Okay.
Far exceed. And
let's do the podcast.
We should do a podcast about that because there are some crazy ass stories where this feels like, all right, like, they had some fun.
So we'll see. I think we might be continuing this. John Hughes is up. We're trying to, let the grudge match continue. We'll see how it goes.
Who's so far? What's the score?
Oh, I would think Cameron Crowe's up like 2-1.
2-1.
I mean, well, that's literally. Well,
yeah.
I mean,
Maybe.
I mean, I don't think John Hughes hasn't had his best stuff yet. So we say anything is one of Cameron Crowe's best films, and
yeah,
I mean, he's
arguably his best.
Yeah, and we haven't even done 16 Candles, nor have we done Breakfast Clubs, which are kind of like two incredible classics for John Hughes, and he's going to swing out hard with those two films ultimately.
That's right.
They're very, very different, but they're a lot.
Don't count them out.
Yeah. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.